What is up, guys? We are back, and I am joined by MacKenzie Sigalos from CNBC, and we're here to talk about Bitcoin and the mainstream media. MacKenzie, how are you doing today?
Hey, good.
So I want to start things off. Like, Bitcoin gets thrown around in so many conversations, both pro-Bitcoin, anti-Bitcoin, and everything in between. We've seen mainstream media go from being very anti-Bitcoin to sometimes even having reporters like yourself share, the real story behind Bitcoin, not necessarily saying it's pro or anti, but just, finally hearing the truth about Bitcoin. Maybe share with us a little bit about, some of the conversations that you had early on about Bitcoin, just overall throughout the mainstream media landscape.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So when I first started covering this in 2017, the conversation was more about Bitcoin in the context of markets and price moves. And that's when we saw this bull run. And then we went into this crypto winter, and there was less of a focus on coverage of cryptocurrency in general, Bitcoin. And then we started to come out of that at the end of 2020. And that's when I got back on this beat and was able to cover it in a dedicated way starting around this time last year. And I made this move into a tech reporting role. And at the time, they didn't really know what they wanted it to focus on, whether it was cybersecurity or enterprise reporting. And I just knew that I really wanted to make this beat about cryptocurrency. And a lot of my focus has been on Bitcoin in particular. And so in terms of like mainstream media's take on how to cover this space, I think that it's evolved from it being a very markets driven focus where a lot of the emphasis is on price moves and understanding like, what is moving the charts today, to an interest in like the tech and what's going on underneath it. Like I had a story like when I first started out in this role, I was covering Taproot when it first locked last spring, and it was like it led the site over the weekend. And I've covered other like what I thought might be too technical, too in the weeds, like too specific to one side of this narrative, and it really resonates with a general like business news audience. So that's been a really like cool surprise for me. And it's really like opened the doors in terms of being able to cover more of that side of the narrative.
I'm curious too, because like you touched on just right now how like you wrote this piece about Taproot, not expecting it to really gain any traction. And here it is getting eyeball after eyeball. Is that really the driving force, or what would you accredit to sort of this shift in mentality and focus from number go up, number go down to like, what is this technology and how can we use it day to day?
Yeah, I think it's a credit to the audience, right? Like there's just this evolving appetite for understanding how Bitcoin works, not necessarily as a speculative asset to make a bet on, but just, as a monetary system, as a payments network, the energy side and the mining side of this network, which actually secures the entire system. So I think it's interesting to see that readers genuinely care about that. And it's not just, like certain upgrades, like there are other nuances of the wider crypto ecosystem. And I know in this conversation, we're focusing on Bitcoin, but like, we've just realized that there is such an appetite for like, how do the fundamentals work? And so it was a very cool surprise on our end.
I'm gonna poke this as carefully as I can, because we are a Bitcoin only show, and I've been ripped apart for saying anything other than Bitcoin plenty of times before, but that doesn't stop me. Why in mainstream media is there this push to like clump Bitcoin into the same category as crypto? Do you yourself see Bitcoin as crypto, or do you see it, like many of us in this space, as two separate types of technology?
I think that it's a different kind of technology. But to answer your first question, why is it lumped in the mainstream media? Because when you're breaking this down for the layman, the digital assets as a new class of asset, like the crypto asset class, is seen as a collective umbrella term. And of course, Bitcoin being a first mover and the most decentralized and, like the most secure, because it's intentionally kind of moves slowly to not break things as you go. Its first mover status is why we focus on that as a big part of this narrative. But it also was a first mover that then, led the way for other cryptocurrencies. And so it's a good way to put it in context. And so then people are interested in some of the newer blockchains. And so we explain it again in the context of here's how it compares to a Bitcoin, and it, Bitcoin as a coin, as a network, like it's helpful to be able to draw those parallels because of the fact that Bitcoin was first to the game.
And there's also the fact that it's more decentralized. It's not a security, whereas all the other cryptos register as securities. Do you recognize that distinction between kind of Bitcoin and everything else out there?
Yeah, I think that, I was having a conversation with a colleague yesterday just about the, property versus security debate, what in the SEC's role. And I mean, it's obviously an evolving narrative as like the US government also catches up to decide how they want to classify it. And at this point, specifically within the bounds of the US, it's seen as a property. So any kind of, event where you use buy a house in Bitcoin, that's a taxable event because you're essentially liquidating your stake to buy something. So did I answer your question? I feel like I just went in a different direction, like talking about the IRS.
Yeah, I hear the IRS and SEC distinction, but I personally think it would be helpful if mainstream media kind of learned to recognize that, where they tend to conflate the two terms, but they're completely different things, because Bitcoin cannot disenfranchise its users based on the will of a few, whereas all the other cryptocurrencies can, because they're securities that are run by venture capitalists.
I think, one thing that you just talked about, like Bitcoin not disenfranchising users, like that's been the most interesting thing for me in the last year in terms of like different areas that I've covered. So we've talked about how I've like gotten into tech upgrades and they're, like the mining side of it, but I've also looked at like the use case for when Bitcoin in particular is helping systemically disenfranchised groups have an on-ramp to the economy, like their only access to online banking. And I, like in the context of the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan last year, I was looking at a couple of different use cases with respect to like earning an income, like off-ramping cash as people fled the countries, like the traditional banking system collapsed around them. And then you saw that exact same narrative in different ways play out in Ukraine. And I mean, that is what I think is especially impactful when you think about the ways that Bitcoin is being used today.
Do you feel though that like these broader conversations of, yes, we are educating people and letting them know this technology has expanded and has essentially opened the door for all of these other blockchains to essentially be formed off of the heels of Bitcoin. But we also see it time and time again, especially those of us who spend a majority of our time in this space, of the classic scams and rug pulls and everything else that essentially leaves people with a bitter taste in their mouth when they hear even just the word Bitcoin or crypto at large. Like, do you not feel like as part of the media, we have a responsibility to be educating these people as best we can?
I think we are. I think that like our audience is savvy and they realize that decentralized finance is different to Bitcoin. And they realize that the blockchains that are, suffering security breaches are separate to Bitcoin. I don't think that people are conflating that all these blockchains are the same. And, Bitcoin is just as, is subject to the same kind of security flaws as other blockchains that have these like huge hundreds of millions of dollar hacks. I think that we are like, at least in the work that I'm doing, like educating people about, why certain blockchains are more susceptible, like are more vulnerable in general. And so so one, I think we are trying to do that, like kind of point out that there are differences here. And two, I think we have to give the audience credit for understanding that like DeFi is not built on, like the largest blockchain is still Ethereum. Obviously, Solana has become a huge player in the world of decentralized finance, but I think that people understand the distinction. And for those who don't, we're like continually pointing it out in stories as we cover that.
Fair, but I will never allow things like Solana to be considered decentralized finance, given the fact that they're not decentralized and they have a central point of failure. I think whoever the PR person that came up with the slogan DeFi is just spinning everyone out. And like, that's a word that I personally would like to see taken out of the nomenclature, because none of those are decentralized financial protocols. with the exception of Bitcoin. And Bitcoin is not categorized based on the current definition as such. I don't want to spend all of our time debating the minutiae of that. You touched a little bit on how.
Well, wait. Before you move on, like I do think that I think it's something I've looked into with respect to Solana, because I do think that's interesting. Like a lot of people do tout the fact that it is so fast and it is so cheap in terms of the cost of transactions. But there is a trade-off for that, and there is a question of centralization. So I've had conversations with people on both sides of this debate, and there are, I think it's very interesting what you've pointed out. It's something that I'm still reporting on right now, and I do plan to cover. So yeah, an interesting point. Didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
No. I didn't want to put you on the spot having this conversation, which is more why I presented it like that. I would highly recommend you take a look, and we can sidebar about this. I'll email you which episode it was specifically. There's an all-in podcast where both Chamath Palihapitiya and David Sachs point blank admit that they have pre-mined so much Solana that they are now Solana billionaires in their own right, and now have to figure out how to start unloading these coins. But it's not part of the total, float of the Solana tokens that are out there on the marketplace right now. So it starts to beg this question of, okay, are we just witnessing yet another rug pull? While it's said it's faster or whatnot, it's definitely, if you're diving into it, I highly recommend just dissecting that a little bit more, because it again brings back this notion of, is this actually decentralized or not? And
right, decentralized in name only.
Or in branding and marketing only, not even in name. In my opinion.
if you want to call something like Solana decentralized, okay, fair enough. But then you need a totally new term for Bitcoin, which is exponentially more decentralized, as the cost of running a node is, far cheaper, and there are tens of thousands of us running them.
That is the other side of it, the cost of running a node, and then some of the other how they're able to move so fast, like some of the basic protocols of the kind of the underbelly of it. I agree. Send me the episode. I think it's an interesting point that you just made about, and that idea of VCs owning large swaths of Web3 is something that's also been brought up by the likes of Jack Dorsey, and just, this idea of it being a decentralized version of the web. You also have to consider who has skin in the game with respect to investments, which is another point that I think is interesting that has been made that I'm looking into.
Awesome. Well, we do appreciate everything you do. I think you are one of the few people out there who's genuinely reporting on the facts and not conflating things for the sake of story. Your articles dissecting just the way Exxon was expanding into Bitcoin mining, I found very fascinating. But before we go on to just mining in specific, I do want to talk some legislative stuff with you. You touch a little bit on the fact that, we're all sort of waiting for the day when the IRS or whoever the powers may be finally dictate and say to the world, hey, everything else is a security and Bitcoin itself is an asset class. I'd love your thoughts just generally of what you're paying attention to out of DC, or any legislative efforts that are really taking up your focus right now.
Yeah, I mean, there have been a couple of different things that have been really interesting as of late. I think that everybody saw the Biden executive order as a huge win for the industry. And then the conversation swiftly, took a hard right turn to New York and what's going on there. And so that's what I've been paying a lot of attention to this week. I'm working on a story about it right now. And it is mining specific, so I don't know if you want to wait to talk about it, but that's hugely important in terms of legislative movement that's happening within the US. It's similar to a measure in the EU that was being considered with respect to, stamping out proof of work mining operations, which is which is virtually synonymous with Bitcoin mining, and securing the network. So those, with respect to regulation, those are the things that I've been thinking about a lot. If we want to hold off on getting into the mining side of things, the one other point that I'll make is that I think what was so interesting was in August of last year, $1 trillion rubber stamped infrastructure bill was held up for a week and a half by a voting contingent that I think a lot of people didn't even realize was there. And so I've increasingly been having these more, politically minded conversations with people at Bitcoin Miami. And I was at a dinner the other night and I met somebody who's running for office for Congress in California on, it's not Bitcoin specific, but it's a crypto platform. And what I find interesting is that you have these groups of people who are raising a lot of money to support candidates who are pro-Bitcoin and pro-cryptocurrency more generally, but also to support candidates who just don't speak negatively about the industry in general. So like, it's like just voting out Bitcoin haters. And it's just, I think it's fascinating. And we're going into midterms later this fall. And so the importance and the relevance of this, this Bitcoin voting contingent, I think is hugely relevant, and also in a way that people weren't talking about it before August now they are. Sorry, that was kind of roundabout, but
no. I love that. I was taking notes of so many different jumping off points that we're about to dive down, but I want to start first with, what are your expectations? Respectfully, I know you're not spending your time on the political space, but like, we're seeing Bitcoin, as you've mentioned, and crypto at large become a big talking point for politicians, especially now. How much do you think this is going to take center stage in this year's midterms? And do you think this could be something that swings the House or the Senate in a specific direction?
Yeah, I think that down the line it could. Do I think it will be like the go-to issue this fall? No, but it's increasingly important. And like you look at what's being said by, Mayor Francis Suarez was really like the first to, among the first movers. Texas has incredibly crypto progressive, Bitcoin progressive politicians. When you think of Governor Greg Abbott, Senator Ted Cruz. I spoke with the mayor of Fort Worth, who just literally started her own Bitcoin mining operation inside City Hall. In New York, politicians skew different ways, but at least their new mayor, Eric Adams, is supportive of the industry generally. So I do think it's interesting to see how politicians now realize that like they need to have a stance on it either way, and like there are a lot of spoke with Senator Lummis a couple of weeks ago about like the very progressive views that she has and the way that she's kind of instituted this open door policy for different sides of the industry and why that's been good for the state.
I was laughing hysterically at the idea that Eric Adams is anything more than, in my opinion, a grifter for votes, telling people that he's pro Bitcoin, and then immediately saying, "Oh, I'm pro Bitcoin and Ethereum." And here we are now with them about to pass through legislation to essentially say Bitcoin mining has these restrictions based on clean energy usage. I'd love your thoughts. Like, you spend a lot of time reporting on the mining. You've seen firsthand the way miners and those developing new techniques to capture energy are figuring out ways to offset their carbon footprint as a result. Do you think that this is going to help that initiative, or do you think this is going to hold back Bitcoin? And I'll even open the door to just broader crypto development in the state of New York.
Yeah. So the thing is, for those who where we are on this legislation, and what they're proposing is a 2-year moratorium on permits for proof of work mining that that runs on power plants powered by fossil fuels, right? So it's pretty limited in the scope of what it's saying, and it's to issue new permits, and then it would block the renewal of existing permits, and it wouldn't let existing operations expand their footprint. And so you think, okay, well, it's only blocking out like this one particular type of power source. And hey, there are a lot of like renewable run Bitcoin mines in New York. There's a lot of hydropower. There's nuclear power that's used. So there are a lot of like green energy sources in New York, and that's a different conversation. But the thing is that when you stamp out this corner of the industry, it does a couple of things, right? So one, it scares people. So they think, okay, well, we don't really have crypto-friendly policymakers. And yes, this is where it starts, but where does it go from here? Does this kind of like open the door to more aggressive legislation that could completely like block out the industry? So then like new players think, well, maybe I won't get involved in New York. Let me go to a different state. So it shifts the hash rate elsewhere. And New York is a huge player, not just nationally, but like on the world stage. Like I've seen some pretty high percentages with respect to the share of hash rate that is specifically coming out of New York. So then what are the drawbacks to a lot of miners leaving New York? Well, it's not just that they would shift elsewhere, and that, perhaps like hydropower that otherwise would have been used for this will, that operation will shift elsewhere. New York is a first mover with respect to policy. So I think that the other concern that's come up is that, hey, New York, if they pass this, they've written the blueprint that then can be used by other states. And so then there is this ripple effect across the country. And, I was having this great conversation with Perry Ann Boring of the Chamber of Digital Commerce earlier this week. I'm going to look at so she was basically making the point that the sustainable energy mix of the global Bitcoin mining industry today is estimated to be just under 60% globally. And like their estimates for New York specifically is that the number is closer to 80%. And so the thing is that as you start to shut down this industry, you're kind of going to shut out a lot of that. And there's so many more nuances to that, but that's kind of where I think we should start with respect to what's going on in New York.
No, please feel free to expand on that. That is genuinely my fear, is that like you're creating these restrictions to stifle innovation. And now you've introduced a new level of fear all of a sudden. People are disincentivized to come to your state. And then meanwhile, you have a state like Texas that is continuing to push forward pro-Bitcoin legislation. You have the first city official and government in America mining Bitcoin. Like that is a signal to many Bitcoin companies to come to Texas. And at the same time, like being given the bird by the city or the state of New York. Oh, I think you're frozen. Oh, she is definitely frozen. All right. Alex, I'd love your thoughts until we get MacKenzie back of just like, I mean, I think you agree with both of what MacKenzie and I are saying, that this is essentially going to be holding back innovation and development.
Yeah, I think it will. States, Bitcoin, individuals, entities that adopt Bitcoin will rise. Entities that do not will fall, basically. I mean, relative to each other. And over long periods, I think there won't be businesses that don't accept Bitcoin, states that don't accept Bitcoin. We've seen this technology only grow. I mean, really, when people, once you grok it, you don't really go back. At least the way Bitcoin currently operates. It's ends up being a net positive for the user, whether they're an institution or an individual, and they don't really go backwards and reject Bitcoin. That's not happening very often.
All right, we have MacKenzie back now.
Hey, sorry.
No, good. We were essentially just continuing the conversation and dialogue. I think we lost you just after asking you to sort of expand on this idea that, you know, we're going to be watching states like Texas continue to bolster and push up Bitcoin and Bitcoin businesses, while we're now essentially having the state of New York give Bitcoin and Bitcoin businesses the middle finger.
Yeah. I mean, really quickly about Texas, like what's especially interesting there is that you have the use cases for so many different power sources, right? Like you've got on-grid Bitcoin mining. We can go into that in a minute, why that's a good thing, and it's fundamentally misunderstood. You've got renewable powered mining operations in West Texas, where you've the intersection of the wind belt and solar, like where, you know, peak solar is in the country. You've got oil and gas majors using, natural gas they can't get into a pipeline that they otherwise would flare, being channeled into these Bitcoin mining operations. And it's just like all this microcosm of all the different examples of how this can be hugely beneficial and actually, help companies hit ESG targets, thinking about oil and gas companies. So yes. Do I think that this will shift hash rate elsewhere in the country? Yes. Do I think that Texas will be one of those beneficiaries if this passes in New York? Yes. But I think that the concern is, and why I like every conversation that I have related to the New York legislation is why people who have skin in the game in Texas and not necessarily New York. So why do they care? Like if they're in Texas, they're not in New York, why do they think that this is bad? And they think it's bad because it sets a precedent that will have a domino effect across the country, that will be the first of like more aggressive changes to come. And then what does that mean for the viability of the industry across the US? Like if this then gets, kicked up to a federal mandate. And again, like I said, like the EO from Biden was pretty generous, and a lot of people saw it as a win. But then, do we have a separate narrative emerge that's specific to the energy side of this? Where do you want to go next? There's so much we can get into with respect to mining.
I want to get in a moment into the on-grid mining stuff, because I do think that's a very valuable thing for us to really break down so that people can understand and explain, both for them to understand and then explain onwards to the next person. But I want to, there's another side of the coin too, where this domino effect of New York's legislation and every other state sort of seeing it and following suit, but you're also seeing like I believe it was a senator or a congressperson from South Dakota offering to bring businesses, Bitcoin businesses over to South Dakota. We have Senator Loomis in Wyoming continuing to push forward legislation. Do you think that this could turn into almost like in the same way we watch sort of reopening and mask mandates start to make decisions for, we saw businesses in my home state of California start to jump ship, and the exodus from California to Florida and Texas is very, very real. Do we start to see a similar play out with Bitcoin mining and the laws in place, where you'll have some states that are going to be very freedom focused, very oriented towards helping miners set up and operate, versus more restrictive measures that are going to just prevent Bitcoin businesses from operating in those states?
Yeah, I think there's absolutely the potential for that from the conversations that I'm happening, like a polarizing effect where you see that there are certain states that are more crypto friendly jurisdictions, which is one of the core components of being an ideal destination for a Bitcoin miner. Think back a year ago, so it's upwards of 75 to 80% of the network was in China. So that literally, it was so quickly it shifted over to the US, and it came to the US because it was a generally, for a couple of different reasons, the cost of energy, the fact that there was infrastructure ready to go and just have people plug in their gear, or, have their new deliveries installed in the US, but also crucially, number 3 on that list, if not number 1 for other people, is the how crypto friendly the political jurisdiction is, because that has huge implications, as you just saw play out when China banished all of its Bitcoin miners.
No, absolutely. I mean, to expand on that idea too, is I think the stability of the government and belief that the government, that jurisdiction at least, is going to be pro Bitcoin or pro cryptocurrency, or just pro what you need it to be, versus on a whim, you can see certain regimes just flip the switch. I'm curious your thoughts on just sort of, as we saw yesterday with the Central African Republic now announcing Bitcoin as legal tender, news circulating around Panama, which we will be giving an update during the last hour of our show about what's going on down in Panama. There still seems to be no real substantive conversation to push the ball forward for Bitcoin as far as legal tender, expanding on its sort of use cases or abilities here on a legislative level. I'm curious your conversations, if you've heard anything beyond just sort of the classic rumor mill that's circulating Twitter right now. Yeah,
I mean, so when I think about the conversation in the US with respect to this idea of Bitcoin being used as legal tender, the narrative immediately goes to El Salvador. And obviously there have been a lot of, I haven't personally covered this in the last month or so, but there have been a lot of stories that have come out that have looked at, drop-offs and the Chivo wallet, use of the Chivo wallet, pointing to some of the vulnerabilities of the rollout and how it's gone 1 year on. And that's more of the narrative that I've seen. But what do you guys think? How do you think the El Salvador experiment is playing out right now?
I think it's playing out the way it's meant to play out. I'm a big believer that, the way Bitcoin is going to be adopted is going to be slow and steady, and then all at once at a time. And that goes on a global scale as well as a localized scale. You'll see slow adopters, and then eventually there's going to be a decision maker who can really make or break how this technology gets expanded on, such as a president of a country seeing the viability of, hey, we don't really have a national currency. We need to figure out some way for our citizens to be able to interact with money that's not beholden to the powers that be. I'm a big proponent and believer that every single country who is essentially being cut out of the US money printing system is going to look to Bitcoin first, and they're going to slowly but surely adopt Bitcoin before all of the Western countries, and then the West is going to be playing catch up. The West has enough wealth that catch up will let them sort of have an equilibrium or still give them some sort of an advantage. But I definitely see more countries like El Salvador and the Central African Republic adopting Bitcoin long before I see any modern westernized countries really do it.
Now, this is not the same thing as adopting it as legal tender, but I was having this really interesting conversation with Alex Gladstein, and he was making the point that, Russia, it had this $630 billion nest egg, but it had its FX reserves weaponized against them, as the West kind of instituted a lot of these sanctions and froze, currencies that were in that, what was meant to be a war chest to help them stave off the effect of economic blockades. And so the point that he was making was this sort of dictator's dilemma, where you would think that a country like China or Russia would typically be resistant to a currency that they don't control, that is like outside their hands. But it also means that other nation states can't weaponize it against them. And so and so it was this interesting idea that, like, perhaps could they be like the first at it to, be among the major nations to first put it on their balance sheet as a way to almost protect themselves. And then I was thinking this again because last week, the latest round of sanctions that included BitRiver, which is a company that mines for Bitcoin. They have operations across Russia. They're technically headquartered elsewhere. But anyways, the point that was made in this in this document from the government there was a fear that Russia could evade sanctions because of the proceeds from Bitcoin mining in the country. And so there is this, and we're not getting into the sanctions debate right now. Like, we don't have to do that because there are so many reasons why that's also been debunked. But the idea of it being a sort of protectant against currency being weaponized against them is interesting. And I just thought of it when you were talking about adoption at the national scale.
Yeah, I think you'll first see nations come to Bitcoin who need a problem solved. Like, they come to Bitcoin with a defensive strategy in mind. They don't have control of their own currency. They don't control the mint. They're not close to the money printer, so they're not quintillionaires. So I think you'll see them come first, and you'll see the West's response at first being like hemming and hawing, trying to squash Bitcoin, and then realizing they can't. And as Q said, then finally adopting it to compete. The funny thing about that is I think they'll absolutely be penalized in terms of price appreciation, and they're not going to be able to stack thousands of Bitcoins the way, Sailor or an El Salvador has at all, right? Anyone who's been in Bitcoin for a couple of years knows, your first 10 Bitcoins easy going, next 10 not so, or 100 depending on the period you got in. Or even nowadays, people are struggling to get to a single Bitcoin. So that proof of work really is going to penalize laggards on a nation state level.
So what do you say, like, when you are trying to debunk or respond to somebody who says, hey, Bitcoin can never be the world's reserve currency because there are only ever going to be 21 million coins. What happens when you go into a recession? And I get the whole point is that you're not printing money. And that's a great thing because you're not going to deal with the inflation that can come with that. But what do you say to naysayers about Bitcoin becoming the world's reserve currency?
I think they don't understand scarcity because we've never encountered anything like it in the world. Like, gold has a perceived scarcity that's not absolute. There's more gold than we would ever know what to do with. The fact is, we've only scratched the surface of the earth, literally, in searching for 0.000 1% of the gold out there. But that's very tightly controlled, right? So that gives you a feel for what hard money should be. But in terms of reserve currency, what you want is a store of value and something that can operate also as a medium of exchange and unit of account. And I think Bitcoin has more than proven itself as a great store of value. That absolute scarcity brings the conservation of energy into the digital realm where it wasn't before. And you're going to see all these wonderful new use cases emerge. And, chief among them being people actually being able to build things on a hard money standard. I think as a society, we've kind of stalled in all areas, and we're just kind of shuffling things around here in terms of academia. You see this in science, technology. There's not much happening. I mean, you could take the optimistic side of that coin, but compared to the innovations that came out of something like the Renaissance, where we were as a society on a hard money standard, I mean, what we're living in now is just kind of just a mess of central planning. And I think Bitcoin is the one route out of that. Sorry, that's a pretty long-winded answer to your question.
I think
no, it's helpful.
To add to that too, and my base case argument always goes back to this idea that in all of our lifetimes, all of us having this conversation right now, we have only ever known both the US dollar as the global reserve currency and no sort of gold standard. However, if you go back historically speaking, we've changed what the global reserve currency was based on what the world power was at the time. And also, we have historically done this mistake over and over and over again and seem to have never learned the mistake of removing ourselves from a gold standard or having some sort of a hard money backing a fiat currency. You can go as far back as to the Renaissance days when the first and earliest banks were really formed, and they took a gold standard fiat currency off of the gold standard, and it was almost cyclical within an estimated 50-year cycle. Every single time this has happened historically, we end up seeing mass inflation, and the final catalyst to really kill the fiat currency is price control. Every single time this has happened historically, those have been the catalysts that led to that fiat currency that was the global reserve currency of the time being eliminated and a new system having to be formed. We're just unfortunately alive and witnessing that happen in real time. I highly recommend Eric Yates' book, The Seventh Property. He does a fantastic job of really explaining the history of banking a lot more than some of these other Bitcoin books explain the history of money. And that history of banking really paints this picture of these 50-year cycles where fiat currencies tend to die, and the final catalyst to kill them is a price control from the government.
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to add to that real quick, Q. I think like a great answer to the question you asked previously, MacKenzie, is people don't understand what money is. They don't fully appreciate it. And that's not a slight. I was definitely there too. I think most like pre-Bitcoiners are. They don't understand that there's a distinction between fiat money and money that's chosen by the people. And we were raised believing, and have been for generations, that money is issued by the state. And what we really need is to sever money and state, because the state has proven day after day that they are not responsible, and the incentives will never align to make them responsible and to act appropriately when in control of a money printer. So what you do is you separate money from state, and you return money to its in fact truer definition, which is something like Bitcoin, which is not issued by a centralized entity and can't be printed arbitrarily or debased. And then you get closer to a hard money standard, and everyone reaps the benefits of that.
Does the US government realistically let that happen in the next 20 years? And if they don't, do you guys leave the US? Like, how strongly do you feel about being based where you are versus going elsewhere to more, friendly government?
If I could genuinely figure out an easier way to travel my girlfriend's dog around the country and world, I would not be in Los Angeles. But I am of the minority who doesn't think in my lifetime the US dollar necessarily goes away. I definitely think that when I'm old and gray, like, there'll still be some sort of a dollar transaction, but what the dollar is backed off of will look drastically different. But that's just my opinion and speculation.
Yeah, I think in our lifetime it's gonna get pretty hairy here. It's gonna get pretty scary. We're gonna see these central bank surveillance coins, as I like to call them, issued out by the US government. We're gonna see the US dollar as we know it probably fail. Although it is the strongest of the government issued currencies, we've seen them kick the can down the road for like over 100 years, and they might continue doing so. But I think more and more people are realizing this is not a store of value. This taxation is a theft of my time. This inflation is the most subversive theft of my time and energy, right? If you just worked at your job day after day, blue collar, whatever, you work at a grocery store, if you didn't get like a 20% raise, you got a pay cut this year. People are starting to realize that. This is the beauty of the internet and decentralization.
Yeah, Marty Bent had this like great post a couple of weeks ago, and it was in the context of when the weekend after the country of Lebanon declared bankruptcy. Essentially, people lost their life savings overnight. Like if your savings, which for a lot of people it was denominated in the local currency, that went away. And what Marty was saying is that anyone who is, and this is his opinion and a widely held opinion, but if anyone stores their life savings in any sort of fiat currency over a long enough time horizon, it'll be a similar narrative to what we just saw happen in Lebanon. And it is an interesting idea, this erosion of personal wealth. You perhaps you don't feel it on a day-to-day basis, but certainly over the course of time, like it'll, we're just seeing it happen in a very protracted, in a very small timeline in countries like Lebanon.
Yeah, and I think to answer your question, like if you're asking me personally, how strongly do I feel about it? Very, very, very strongly. These principles are like first and foremost to me. If the United States banned Bitcoin or somehow made it, that doesn't affect the protocol fundamentally. I could still transact peer-to-peer. I could still buy goods and services from Chris or Q or even you with Bitcoin, no issue. But I'm absolutely going to vote with my feet, and live in the most friendly place for Bitcoiners to live. There's a variety of those places now, but right now it's not so bad in the U.S. You can buy goods and services with Bitcoin. It's great. It's deemed as a property. It's going very well, I would say. I just think it's going to get very, very dicey when people start to realize that they've been screwed by the government in terms of their money, and they need a exit hatch, and they're all going to come to Bitcoin. And I think a lot of them actually, let me correct that, won't come to Bitcoin first. You see what happened in Lebanon. People did not flock to Bitcoin. Some people did, but they run to other stable coins. They try to get closer to the dollar. They try to get closer to any stronger currency, but hopefully with the new, stable coins on top of Lightning, something like that, they can at least have the security of Bitcoin in the future. And they won't have to tolerate its relative volatility. If they can't, they can swap in and out of whatever stable currency they want.
Yeah, two thoughts on what you just said. The first was like that point about the resiliency of the network, and that is the conversation in the context of what might happen with New York, what happened with China last year. Like obviously a nation state stamping out its crypto mining industry, its Bitcoin mining industry doesn't affect the network. Like it kind of moves on without skipping a beat. But you also brought up the point that you can still transact in it. You like switch over to peer-to-peer networks, and so you do it in a different way. And you've seen that play out in Nigeria. Like the government, when they chose to ban crypto mining, or not crypto mining, sorry, when they really went aggressively against like crypto in general, I believe it was last year around this time. It was at a point at which in the country adoption was already so huge and so prevalent that it just kind of drove the industry underground instead. And so the peer-to-peer exchanges are still, if anything, they've gone tremendously up. And so it's one of those examples where you do see this idea of resiliency plays out. And then your later point about, people like typically go to stable coins first, like that's something else that's come up, that like Tether was quite huge in Ukraine as people were, looking to use that instead of necessarily having Bitcoin be their first port of call. Yeah, just my 2 cents on those 2 points.
I want to also just sort of present this question back to you, Mackenzie. I mean, we have in this country now, like I'll call it since about 2016, we've been seeing a divisive nature and a lack of trust between citizens and the government and just central planning in general. We saw it really take shape during the pandemic, and you see a lot of people are just frustrated and sick of the government, who seems to be on their own little castle, doing their own little thing. The rules don't apply to them. And meanwhile, they dictate to everyone else what to do. And then to couple that, we're now starting to feel the effects, monetarily speaking, where you go to the grocery store now and eggs are $1 more, $1.25 more for a dozen eggs. You're seeing the price of milk start to go up. Like you're having a harder time putting food on the table for your family. Meanwhile, Congress is getting another raise this year. Meanwhile, you're seeing like a lack or a disconnect from our political leaders and the actual citizens. And I think that's helping to feed into some people going in and adopting Bitcoin. Other people are looking elsewhere, but finding sort of that thing to align with that takes them away from aligning with the government. I'm curious your thoughts on just this idea that Bitcoin is one of those things that people can start to align with separate from the government here, domestically speaking.
Yeah, I over the past year, basically since I've been on this beat as a, since I joined the technology team at CNBC, I've been at CNBC for longer, but since I've been in this dedicated role, I've lived in a couple different places. So I was in San Francisco, but I spent a lot of time in Texas last year, specifically because of like it's a fascinating place with respect to the mining industry, but also with respect to like the Bitcoin contingent who lives in Austin and other parts of the country. I spent some time in Houston and all over the place. And I just bring this up because it's a much different mindset in Texas than it is in California, than it is in DC, than it is in New York, which is where I also spent time last year. So I was kind of like all over the political spectrum, so to speak, like across the country. And the sentiment that really comes up again and again among the people that I spoke to in Austin and Houston, and I spent a little bit of time in Dallas too, is this idea of, and it aligns with like the narrative with respect to COVID restrictions as well, is this idea of political freedom and having that ability to have independence from the state and to make decisions that aren't being dictated so closely with respect to personal choices medically or with respect to your finances. So the kind of hands-off approach of the state is hugely welcomed by a lot of the folks that I spoke to there. But I don't know, does that answer your question? Maybe like, it's just like an observation that I've had, because like obviously the Texas mindset is much different to San Francisco, which is different to DC, to New York, et cetera.
I can speak to the LA mindset where everyone, like the moment they started saying, oh, let's wear masks again, I literally threw a fit and said, absolutely not. I would rather just drive myself everywhere and not drink than have to go back into an Uber with a mask. But that's just like, I'm definitely in the minority here, unfortunately. But like there is this push of libertarianism within the Bitcoin ecosystem because it essentially feeds into that idea. My last sort of question on this topic before we really dive in to just mining in general. I know we don't have a ton of time left with you, but what is, I think, in your opinion, what is the worst case scenario of what the government, US government can do specifically towards Bitcoin legislative wise?
I think that a lot of people felt that the worst case scenario was avoided in this latest executive order, which was, and I know I've said this a couple of times, which was largely pretty positive. And I think the worst mistake you can make is try to take an approach like the government of Nigeria has, like just to ban an entire industry, which is so firmly a part of the financial system now. Like every major bank on Wall Street has their, and I feel bad saying the word crypto now on this call, on this talk after I know that we're focusing on Bitcoin, but like, every bank has like, a crypto desk. And so it's, and that's just like one bellwether, like one indication of how this is very much here to stay. So, and so I think the worst case scenario would be just to try to, totally ban an asset class, because it just doesn't make sense. Like it doesn't, it's about understanding how to, create rules and regulations that make sense. And like so many of the companies in this space have said that they welcome that kind of rulemaking instead of, retroactive decisions that would be made about things that are happening now. So I think that the landscape is open to it, happy for it. I think it will be interesting. Like this was something that you guys brought up a little bit ago, but how does a CBDC in the US play out? Like obviously the EU one is much farther along, and there has been conversations about this idea of, I was talking to Andrew Yang about the idea of a CBDC, and some of the benefits are like, let's say you want to give stimulus money, but there are certain, rules that you apply to that cash, and you have to spend it within a couple of weeks. You can only spend it at like smaller businesses. Like those are interesting characteristics that might be possible through a centrally distributed form of cash. But then what you guys were talking about earlier is also there's a new level of surveillance that's introduced if you're now using a central, like a currency that's issued by a central bank. And so it opens a can of worms with respect to what does that mean? What are the implications of that? So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
My big takeaway from that was the fact that I think we have taught MacKenzie that Bitcoin and crypto are separate, and hopefully this starts to infiltrate the rest of the CNBC ranks.
No, I knew that before, right? I knew that before.
Fair. I want to now go over though and focus the rest of our conversation on mining. And I want to start with a question that we got from one of our commentators or commenters, specifically just on the difference between proof of work and proof of stake. We're seeing a lot of conversation right now go on in the EU pushing forward, maybe probably working with Vitalik. Okay, yes, that's me just wearing my tinfoil hat saying that. But we are seeing a big push around proof of stake. I'm curious your thoughts, what you're seeing both domestically and conversations elsewhere about why we as Bitcoiners really want to stick to the proof of work and why legislators, for whatever reason, have this idea that proof of stake is better.
Yeah, it's because it becomes this binary choice between what takes less energy, and there's less thought about what it means for the decentralization of a network. Now, obviously, since 2014, Ethereum has been talking about this migration from proof of work to proof of stake. And it looks like it will happen Q3, but we'll see how they go. But the bottom line is that people immediately make a couple of assumptions, right? So one, that energy consumption is the same thing as your carbon footprint. They're not. Like, you have to look at your energy inputs. So there's like the energy side of it, like just understanding that like energy consumption versus carbon footprint. That's one. And then two, realizing that like proof of stake versus proof of work is not just an automatic, like one is a winner with respect to ESG and one is a loser. Because again, it's just like it's a more nuanced conversation. And then understanding the trade-off also of having a more decentralized network. Now I'm going to let someone on this panel, like I could give you my definition of proof of stake, but I think I'm going to butcher it compared to one of the experts. So can somebody just like quickly like lay it out, like explaining how like kind of your stake of the currency determines how much say you have in terms of securing a blockchain?
Yeah, that's it. I mean, your stake is proportional to your kind of control over some aspect of how the currency is used, or like what rules are followed. So if Bitcoin is proof of work to take the thing out of the hands of people, right? This is what's so great about it. So you can't simply change Bitcoin to proof of work, as we know. That's just not how this thing, it has no value proposition without proof of work. Proof of work is the very thing that introduces, true decentralization, digital scarcity, conservation of energy into cyberspace. Like, this is the genius of this invention is proof of work. Whereas proof of stake, all these other cryptocurrencies are functionally not too much different from what we have now, which is a proof of stake system where those who are closest to the money printer control, or who develop the rules around the monetary supply and issuance tend to benefit more because they have a greater stake in the game. So that's like a completely unfair system. This is why you see wild wealth distribution in the United States and other countries. I don't know if Q or Chris had a definition there that they wanted to.
I mean, I think you kind of hit the head on the nail. I'd never say that right, I don't think. Just this idea that, if we were to be on proof of stake here on Bitcoin, like someone like Michael Saylor or some of these OG whales can just sort of dictate and decide out how the network is now going to operate. So you almost reintroduce this issue of the richest people having the most influence over society, protocol, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and you look at these cryptos, they all have like 60% pre-mines. So that's a 60% stake. That means they dictate the rules of the currency. That means they can rug pull you. They can disenfranchise you by changing the rules, and you're not interested in the new rules, so you don't upgrade and you lose all your wealth. That doesn't happen in Bitcoin. And this proof of work, this energy expenditure that mainstream media has painted Bitcoin as somehow evil and like demonized us for is totally backwards and absurd. Like, you've got people advocating for society to go back to run on the same technology that like we were running on in like the 1800s, like water wheels. Energy expenditure is a measure of how progressive like a society is, and we should be expending greater and greater amounts of energy and harnessing greater and greater resources without ruining our planet. So like the two things I would say to kind of break up that misunderstanding are: energy expenditure is not inherently bad, right? That's just a fact. And secondly, like Bitcoin incentivizes renewable, cheap forms of energy. It's not this great coal guzzling technology, and it won't always be. Using coal, they're incentivized. Miners are incentivized to seek out remote sources of energy, hydro, nuclear, solar, wind, what have you. But just look at the state of the green energy lobby, and you know, how many cities have they powered with their solar energy and wind? They're just not viable solutions to these problems.
I mean,
Nuclear is, but we refuse to tolerate it for some reason.
Yeah. I mean, going back to what you're saying about renewable, there's just not the financial incentive in a lot of places in remote West Texas where you don't have the infrastructure built to even put it on the grid. And so now you've got Bitcoin miners that are location agnostic, who you can drive up a trailer of thousands of Bitcoin miners. You create a financial incentive to build out the infrastructure to, harness that power while you build a grid infrastructure to get it out there to actually put it on the grid. And then the other thing that I think that is fundamentally misunderstood is that adding extra demand, well, a certain kind of extra demand to a power grid can be a good thing. And what the power demand that Bitcoin miners add is something that is very flexible. It's a controllable load resource, which just means that you can toggle your demand up and down to meet the needs of the grid. And the reason that kind of like very flexible baseline energy consumer is important is because it balances out these inherently volatile power sources like solar and wind. Because when you add that onto a grid, it's not automatically a good thing. Because you need to be able to balance it out when it's not windy or when it's not sunny. And if you don't have that base load, which a Bitcoin mine can be, then you got problems. And that's something that I think that I think there is a gap in understanding there.
Yeah, and there's been a totally misdirected sort of narrative around this. I think these kind of like weird narratives that emerge and these entire businesses that are built around kind of like government subsidies, I think they just happen by accident. It's just like a weird blip. It's like just the strange outcome of the simulation of all the cumulative algorithms that we have, that you get something like a Tesla, right? That would probably be like the champion of like the green energy crowd. This is just a great virtue signal. Tesla still needs to burn, like at bottom, you still have to burn coal to get this thing powered. I mean, some people can pull energy from their house to supplement it a little bit, but you're just outsourcing the engine from the car to a power plant 100 miles away, which is probably good in terms of like getting pollutants out of localized areas, right? That's like a step in the right direction. But I think it's important that we're honest about what these technologies are actually bringing. And it's time to reevaluate our grids in general. And I think Bitcoin is the future of energy production.
MacKenzie, I'm also curious, like ESG has become this sort of hot button issue within the investing space for a few years now, but really picked up steam over the course of the last two in particular. And it almost feels like a lot of the ESG narrative, to Alex's point, like Tesla made more money before it started to actually make cars, and those cars made them money last year. All of its profits were coming from carbon credits that fell under this sort of ESG bucket. Like the ESG narrative seems to fit and help some companies, while then it goes and attacks other very viable forms of business or technology, one of those being Bitcoin. I'm curious your thoughts on how this balancing act is playing out both in the broader tech space and then specifically with Bitcoin and crypto. Oh, not again. I guess this might be a lesson that CNBC's internet access isn't as good as they tell you.
Okay, back.
There we're at.
Yeah, no, clearly it's not as good as they tell you. I can still hear you.
You heard that.
I'm plugged in with an Ethernet cord in the flash cam. Wait, let me show you. Oh, I can't move this around to show you where I am. Sorry. So, okay, to answer your question, we're going to start with the back half of it. When I think of ESG, In the context of Bitcoin, my mind just immediately goes to the oil and gas companies that have these super aggressive like ESG targets, like getting rid of flaring natural gas. And what's interesting to me is that finally this year we're seeing like these major publicly traded companies. Some choosing to go public, like ConocoPhillips did, and then Exxon has been working with Crusoe Energy up in the Bakken in North Dakota to do just that. And I think there's been this general concern that being associated, general concern among oil and gas majors that being associated with Bitcoin mining would be terrible for their ESG narrative, or like it would spook shareholders. And if anything, on the days that like I wrote both of those stories, like the stock didn't do anything. Like I think that it's helped to normalize this idea. And I think that people are starting to understand like, oh yeah, this is like a really useful way to avoid having to flare gas and like, in a worst case scenario, vent gas. So I think that idea is being normalized, and it's actually like, I think there's been a lot of education in recent months. Like, obviously I'm not the only person who's writing about this, around this idea of like the aggressive oil and gas ESG targets. Bitcoin miners can be a part of helping them reach and attain those goals. So that's been very interesting to me. Now, the whole, like, kind of going back to what we were talking about with New York lawmakers considering banning new Bitcoin mining operations, certain proof of work mining operations. Now, what is interesting there is that they're kind of pointing to this it's called the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which mandates that New York's greenhouse gas emissions be cut by 85% by 2050. And so that is where this is getting momentum from. But again, like I said, I was talking to Perry-Ann Boring, and she was one who was making the point that this, like, stamping out this industry is kind of counter to achieving those goals because of the sustainable mix that is powering the Bitcoin mining industry in New York State specifically. And so again, it's not this like binary choice. And again, I think it is being misunderstood. So, and I mean, like, that doesn't go to your entire question, because you're asking about general trends in the tech industry, about ESG. I put that back to you because I focus so much of my attention, I focus just on, crypto and Bitcoin in particular. But how do you think things have been going in the last 6 months with respect to that narrative?
Complete and utter bullshit, just used by certain companies to have an advantageous sticker on their sort of earnings report at the end of each quarter, versus like actually helping either economically or socially, or having like a genuine positive impact to their society is too broad of a word, but their local communities, if you will. I just think it's a gold sticker for adults. That's my opinion on it, quite frankly. But I'm curious more so now on what you're seeing with it on the Bitcoin side of things, and how it's being almost used against some of these Bitcoin companies, especially mining companies in particular.
Yeah, no, I mean, that is the biggest critique. And it goes to what we've said before, like, energy consumption is not the same thing as what your carbon footprint is. If a lot of your inputs are green, then, this is not a bad thing. And you're making the point, Alex, that like, it's not necessarily a bad thing. If anything, it's a good thing if you kind of, expand energy use. It's just about, so that's one part of it. But also, like, Amanda Fabiano, I was talking to her, like, the conference in Miami a couple of weeks ago on a mining panel that we had. And she made the point that, like, you also have to believe that, like, this energy input is being put toward a good thing. Like, it's being put toward a monetary network that has a lot of pluses. So you also have to, like, have buy-in into that. And like, we can, of course, like, run through the laundry list of things of like what consumes more power than this network. So then in part, this is ideological, of course. Like, you have to believe that there's a greater service, and there are so many interesting use cases. And one thing that I know we don't have time to talk about today, but like, I've been spending so much more time thinking about the Lightning Network and talking to Jack Mallers, Elizabeth Stark. Like, there are just so many fascinating things that are happening with respect to layer 2 payment technologies that, I mean, it's disrupting legacy banking systems that have been in place since the 1940s. And that's so interesting to me.
MacKenzie, I want to be respectful of your time. I know that we're coming up on the hour. I'm just telling you right now on the spot, you're going to get emails from me to come back onto the show so we can continue this conversation, because this was too much fun. It's good to know that there's someone in mainstream media who gets it and can hopefully be orange pilling the rest of your colleagues and beyond that. Where can our audience find more about you, stay up to date with your latest articles and research?
Yeah, it was great joining you guys. And I would love to come back. And in terms of following my reporting on Twitter, I'm at MacKenzie Sigalos, and CNBC.com/my name, MacKenzie Sigalos. So that's got all my stories. And we have a daily, digital crypto show called Crypto World. And we have a lot of different coverage. So it's not all Bitcoin, but I'd love to get your voices and perspectives on there. And I'm my DMs are open on Twitter. Please hit me up if you have thoughts or ideas or things that haven't been covered that you think should be. I really welcome input.
Yeah, we love it. We'll drop some of your links in the chat, MacKenzie, and let's get some Bitcoin to our listeners on behalf of this awesome interview, please, Chris. You guys should sorry, I was gonna say CNBC should implement that on your morning crypto show. Drop some free Bitcoin for your listeners.
We will connect you. We will genuinely connect you with the Carrot app team, and they will gift you guys Bitcoin to do that if that's something you want.
I don't know if I'm allowed to.
Yeah, probably not, right?
Many laws and regulations.
Thanks, guys, for the chat. Really interesting, and let's talk more about Lightning the next time. I'll have done more on it by then.
I love it. We'll be back after a quick commercial break, and we're going to break a breaking story about the news going on down in Panama. So stick around, guys, and we'll be discussing all the exciting stuff down there.